The Cardiff Times reported the following story on the 2nd of March, 1895. Quote, "She was awakened by the crash about 5:30. People were rushing about on deck, and the water was coming into her cabin. She made her way on deck and went to the port side. The sea was then very rough, and it was dark but starlight. There was no fog, and no confusion on board. The crew was making efforts to launch the boats, but the ropes were frozen and had to be cut with axes."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The failed evacuation of the Elba.
Here we are. Enjoy!
When the North German Lloyd Line established their fleet of express steamers to take passengers from Bremen to New York, the Elba was the first ship of their fleet. Launched in 1881, the 4,897-ton iron-hulled screw steamer had a top speed of 16.5 knots, though she generally averaged an estimated 14.5 knots on her regular voyages. In total, she had accommodations for 1,310 passengers, 190 in first class, 120 in second class, and 1,000 people in what was considered the immigrant accommodations in steerage. The Elba was a big enough success that the North German Lloyd Line soon ordered 2 sister ships based off of her design. And even later ships that they ordered that were larger in size were clearly based on the Elba. The Elba was therefore a somewhat iconic ship on the lucrative route from Germany to the United States. The Elba had also enjoyed a fairly uneventful life, and up until her sinking, the largest incident she had experienced was the breaking of one of her propeller blades. Not a bad career for a ship that enjoyed over a decade of regular voyages. On the 29th of January, 1895, the Elba departed from Bremen at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Though, as is often the case, there are some discrepancies in various papers about exactly how many people were on board when she departed. It was supposed that she had about 49 saloon passengers and 151 steerage passengers on board. Fortunately, a good deal less than her maximum capacity. In addition to the passengers, she had 155 members of the crew, including the 4 postmen and 2 pilots, all serving under the command of the well-respected and experienced Captain von Gossel. The first leg of their journey was not supposed to be a long one, since they would stop in Southampton before they began to make their way across the Atlantic. The same evening that the Elba was departing from Bremen, another ship was leaving the port. The Crathie was a British iron-hulled screw steamer of 480 tons. The Crathie departed from Rotterdam at 11 p.m. on the 29th of January, carrying a general cargo bound from Aberdeen. She was traveling under the command of Captain Gordon, sailing with a crew of 12. Just like the Elba, the Crathie was considered to be in good repair, and Captain Gordon had as good a reputation by all accounts as Captain von Gossel. The only mark against the condition of the Crathie was that the telegraph that connected the bridge to the engine room was not functioning. This was reportedly due to the incredible cold which had frozen the telegraph equipment and rendered it unusable. The chief engineer of the Crathie would later admit that it had not occurred to him to check it before leaving port. The Crathie sailed past a fleet of fishing vessels between 4 and 5 on the morning of the 30th, near the coast of Suffolk, traveling at about 9 knots. The first mate of the Crathie, Robert Henry Holmes Craig, who was on watch at the time of night, said that he could see the lights of a steamer in the distance, but that he had thought that the ship should pass astern of them, and therefore was not concerned. The wind was blowing hard, and the seas were rough, in addition to the bitter cold. But it was clear enough that they could easily spot the lights of the various vessels around them. On board the Elba, Captain von Gossel, who was on the bridge, had also seen the lights of other ships around their vessel, and was concerned. He gave the order that rockets should be fired at various intervals to warn other ships of their presence and location. When the lookout on the Elba pointed out that there was another steamer approaching them, the order was given to double the rockets to warn them off. First Mate Craig of the Crathie did not get a warning of a potential collision from his lookout, unlike Captain von Gossel. First Mate Craig would say that he had not heard any sound or seen any warning from the oncoming vessel, but that he had heard a noise on his own ship that he thought came from the engine room. It was later determined to be far more likely the sound of the man at the wheel, a man named Orem, who said that he had called out when he saw the Elba's masthead light only 20 or 30 yards ahead of them. Orem would say that he had not received any order to change the course of the Crathie before he called out, and after he called out he was told to change the course to port. But before the helm could respond, the two ships had collided. Captain Gordon, who was asleep in bed at the time, heard the shouts of Orem and jumped up and began to head to the deck as the order was given to change course. First Mate Craig would say that the ship had responded in the space of a few seconds between the order to change course was given and the collision by 3 or 4 points, but this was later pointed out to be a physical impossibility by a former inquiry later. He would also say that he had turned the engine telegraph to signal for the ship to stop, perhaps forgetting that the telegraph was not working. In any case, the second engineer, who was the engineer on duty, would say that he never received the order to stop the engines, though he had stopped them after the collision was felt, without orders, and went on deck to assess the damages. The idea that the Crathie had changed course impossibly quickly, and that he had told the engine room to stop the engines, would prove to not be the only flaws in First Mate Craig's story. The inquiry would also later find that, based on where the ships had collided, and where the first mate said he had been standing, there was no way that he had seen the series of lights from the Elba that he had claimed to have from red to green to red, as he said the other ship had changed course. Unlike on the Crathie, no attempt to change course had been made on the Elba, but they were within their right not to do so. Article 16 of the Regulations for Preventing Collisions at Sea stated that if two steamships were to cross in a way that risked collision, the ship which had the other on her starboard side should change course, while Article 22 said that the other ship should keep her original course. It was only under Article 18 that some fault could be found with the Elba. On seeing that the Crathie was not changing course, Article 18 stated that the Elba should have slowed down and blown her whistle to warn the other vessel, and it was admitted that the Elba had not done either. Why this was not done was never made clear. At approximately 5:40 a.m. on the 30th of January, 1895, the Crathie struck the Elba behind the larger steamer's engine room. As the Crathie wrenched away from the collision, her helm still to port, a massive hole was wrenched into the side of the Elba. The water poured into the Elba's engine room, and soon the Elba's engines were completely still. The Elba had been traveling quickly, though, and still had some momentum, so it would take a little while for the ship to stop traveling. On board the Elba, the impact was not felt particularly strongly. The only people on deck at the time were the members of the crew who were on duty, since the bitter cold and strong winds meant that no one who was not on duty was inclined to leave their beds early. The jolt might not have been strong, but the loud noise did wake some people. All over the ship, people jumped out of their beds and rushed to see what had happened. The English pilot, whose name was Greenham, was engaged on the Elba and was among their number. Like most of the other people on the ship, He had been asleep, but came on deck quickly with the impact. The first order that he had heard Captain von Gossel give was to swing the boats out, but not lower them. This was followed by an order for the crew to go to their stations, which, for Greenham, meant that he went to stand near Captain von Gossel in case his assistance was needed. He therefore heard clearly the next order, that women and children were to go to the starboard boats to be saved first. Each of these orders was given loudly and clearly, with the first mate repeating all of them, and the crew did what they could to obey, though the frozen chains of the lifeboats made lowering them a slow process. It was reported that there was no panic among the crew or the passengers, even though the Elbe was clearly settling under their feet. Second-class passenger Eugene Schlegel jumped out of his berth as soon as he heard the crash, and found that he was knee-deep in water. His first concern was to find his sister, which took 10 minutes, and then they headed to the deck together. When he heard the order that women were to gather on the starboard side to be put in boats first, Schlegel escorted his sister to where the other women had gathered, before going to the port side of the ship where the men were gathering. He would never see his sister again. Soon, the ship would give a lurch, and the passengers who had been calm until that moment began to panic. A man named Vivera was one of the few passengers who were awake when the collision occurred. He was in the smoking room, and as soon as he realized there had been an accident, he went in search of his niece. He failed to find her in the confusion, but not trusting the word of one of the postmen who were on the ship saying that everything was fine, he went to his cabin to put on a mackintosh and hat. Again, he searched for his niece once this was done, but he would never see her again. The first boat Vivera tried to get in, he was told it was only for women and children, so he left it alone. The second boat he saw lowered was done in what he considered a very unprofessional manner by the crew, and it was not completely unfastened from the davits, leading it to tip with the stern straight down to the sea, tipping all the occupants into the sea where they were lost. Now feeling desperate, when he saw another boat prepared, he made an attempt to get in, only to be dragged back by a sailor. He missed his chance to get in the boat in the conventional way, but realizing that he could climb over the bulwarks and jump in as it was lowered, he took the risk. He successfully landed among the people in the boat, and immediately grabbed an oar, preventing them from throwing him out. Karl Hoffmann was traveling with his wife and son when the couple was awoken by the sound of the impact. He threw on a few items of clothing and rushed to the deck. As soon as he realized what had happened, he rushed back down, helped his wife and son get some clothes on, and then brought them on the deck with him. The panic had set in while he had been getting his family ready to go on deck. It was still pitch dark, which added to the confusion of families trying to find one another. And the deck was filled with half-dressed people in the bitter cold shouting for companions. Some people began to shout that there were no more boats, even though Hoffmann could see a boat that the crew was still trying to launch. But they were having to chop the ropes to free it from the frozen davits. The boat was full of people, but the sailors were unable to lower it in spite of all their efforts. Hoffmann took his son in his arms and found a place in one of the boats on the port side of the ship. His wife was just behind him, but just as she was about to follow him into the boat, there was a shout from the captain repeating the order that women and children gather on the starboard side of the ship to be given priority. Hoffmann's wife bolted from his side and ran across the deck in response to the shout. Still clinging to his son, Hoffmann got on the boat, but some men dragged them out, and he said that a member of the crew took his spot. It was clear that the order was beginning to break down entirely. Another boat was prepared, and Hoffmann and his son got in this one instead. But at some point in the rush, Hoffmann realized that his son had been torn from his side and was no longer with him. He tried to return to the ship, but the boat was already descending to the water quickly, and as soon as they touched the water, the sailors pushed off, since With the strong waves, there was a good chance any boat that stayed near the Elbe would be smashed against her side. Vivera would jump into the boat as it was lowered. Possibly the most fortunate of the people on the boat that Hoffman found himself in was a woman named Anna Becker. Her ticket was only for Southampton, so her expected voyage was a short one, and she had not even bothered to undress when she had laid down to sleep. When the collision had occurred, someone had pounded on her door and shouted to her to get ready to leave the ship. She had put on her coat and hat, gathered her valuables, and joined in the rush for the deck. 2 men on the deck helped her into a lifeboat, but as soon as it hit the water it began to sink. Some of the people on the boat managed to cling to the railing of the Elba, which was now close to water level. Becker was among them. On seeing another lifeboat being launched, she pulled herself along the railing and grasped one of the boat's oars. One of the sailors, on noticing her, pulled her into the boat, where she lay at the bottom. She had been in the water for 10 minutes at this point, and with the freezing cold of the water, she was in a very poor condition. The number on the boat, including Hoffman, Vivera, Schlegel, and Becker, was now 20. Among their number was also the Elba's third mate, paymaster, and chief engineer, who were in charge of the boat. Among their number was also Greenham, the pilot. The pilot had stayed by the side of Captain von Gossel for a time before he had sought out a way to escape the ship. The last thing he had said to Captain von Gossel was to ask if the captain required a lifebelt, but the captain had replied quietly that he had no need for one. With that, Greenham had left his side, having decided that there was little else that he could do. 2 minutes after the lifeboat, with these 20 people, had pushed off from the Elba, the Elba suddenly sank beneath the waves, carrying as much as 374 people with her. Despite the crew's good intentions, the Elba had sunk too quickly for the frozen lifeboats to be launched effectively. And as she had developed a strong starboard list as she sank, the boats they had intended to place the women and children in before they evacuated the rest of the ship had been plunged under water without anyone having a chance to use them. With them also were washed away many of the women and children who had gathered on that side of the ship according to the crew's orders. Captain Wright of the fishing smack the Wildflower, out of Lowestoft, and a small crew were occupied in trawling at 11 in the morning, when the ship's cook saw a ship's boat with something fluttering from it. They could see that the waves were crashing over the boat, and they were clearly in distress. Though Captain Wright wanted to go to their aid immediately, he was not able to until they had raised the trawling equipment, which took about half an hour. Worried that they would think he had not seen them, he made sure to wave his hat to tell them help was on the way. Captain Wright also gave the order to prepare some hot chocolate, fearing the effects that the people on board must be experiencing after being drenched in freezing water. Once they were able to get close, they threw them a rope. But the people on the boat were too weak and frozen to pull themselves up it. Instead, the crew of the Wildflower attached the rope to the boat and pulled the boat up to the Wildflower so that the people in the boat could climb on board directly. About half the people on the boat had made the transfer when the line broke, and it was with great difficulty that they attached another one, and the remainder of the people were transferred. Greenham assisted Becker on board the fishing vessel. She had been lying in the bottom of the boat for hours, and was suffering from severe exposure, as was noted by Captain Wright. She was not wearing any shoes, and she had no dress under her coat. With the ice building up wherever water rested due to the cold, he had no doubt that she, as well as several other people on the boat, would not have survived for much longer if they had not been found. Captain Wright took the 20 survivors to Lowestoft, along with the news that the Elba, and most of the people on her, were gone. life-saving crews from multiple stations mobilized despite a building winter gale in hopes of finding more survivors, but they came back empty-handed. The only thing that greeted them were remains washing on the beaches, which were gathered, and all attempts were started to identify them. The survivors still could not say what ship had struck them. It was not until the Crathie limped into Rotterdam that the entire story would be known. The Crathie had not been uninjured in the collision. Her stern and part of her forecastle head were carried away. The cranes for working the anchors were now wreckage on the deck, and about 12 feet of the bow plates on either side of the ship were damaged. Before some of the wreckage that was hanging over the side could be cut away, it pierced 2 plates just above the waterline, meaning water came into the ship every time she rolled. One of the members of the crew was also trapped in the forecastle and had a badly injured head. It was estimated by Captain Gordon that it took about half an hour to free the man and clear the wreckage from his ship. This entire time, the engines of the Crathie were stopped. The Elba had traveled some distance from her, but was still within sight until around 6 in the morning, when the lights of the Elba disappeared. Captain Gordon had assumed that the other ship had sailed away. He waited until dawn before turning his ship in the direction of Rotterdam, where he arrived between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, and reported that they had struck another ship. He had no idea that what he had seen was not the Elba sailing away, but was instead the other ship sinking beneath the waves, with most of the people on board her. What would follow would be a major international incident, as well as a series of claims and disputes. Hoffman, for example, would make many claims against the crew, none of which he had made when he was first rescued, including that his son had been grabbed by the chief engineer and thrown out of the boat rather than lost in the confusion. This was never proven. The crew of the Elba was mostly silent in the face of all these claims, but they also had little to offer to the following investigations. Not a single one of the crew members who had been on duty on deck when the Elba and the Crathie had struck were among the survivors. The passengers would also place strong reproach on the crew of the Crathie, who they accused of abandoning their sinking ship. The passengers said that, had the Crathie helped with her boats, it would have been possible to save almost everyone before the ship sank. There were other things that were easier to prove. First Mate Craig of the Crathie said that there had been a fog which had impeded his vision, but this was quickly disputed by everyone on the Elba. It was also claimed that the North German Lloyd Company instructed their ships to barrel through the ocean on their routes, firing rockets to frighten all other ships out of their way. This was disputed by the North German Lloyd Company, as well as every English pilot who had ever worked on one of the line's ships, who took the claim as a very offensive one. The cook of the Crathie would meanwhile claim that the first mate and lookout man on the Crathie had both been warming themselves in his galley right before the collision, and that they had not been on deck at all, though it was pointed out that he had given 2 official statements before making this claim, where such an important detail was never mentioned. In the end, there would be 2 official inquiries, one in England and one in Germany. The 2 inquiries were greatly hampered by a lack of German witnesses at one and a lack of British witnesses at the other. The 2 countries had tried to negotiate a trade of witnesses, but it had not materialized. The British inquiry concluded that First Mate Craig was negligent in his watch and suspended his certificate, but they did not find fault with Captain Gordon for not checking on the Elba, saying that he had a responsibility to ensure his own ship's safety first. It was rumored that the Emperor of Germany was displeased with this ruling. Though he denied it, it could not be denied he took a personal interest in the incident, however. He issued rewards to the entire crew of the Wildflower. The Empress of Germany, meanwhile, took a personal interest in Anna Becker. The Crathie, which was held responsible for the incident, would be seized to be sold to repay the North German Lloyd Company for their loss, and there would be benefit concerts for the families of those lost. But many people were left feeling a desire for a stronger resolution for a tragedy that had led to the loss of entire families. It would never come, though the name Elba would continue to be mentioned for some time when the subject of tragic ships was brought up.
For more information, please see the Sacramento Daily Union from February 1st, 1895, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.